if someone calls you a name and it hurts, why does it hurt? Does it hurt because they called you the name? Or does it hurt because you don't know who or what you are? And if you don't know who or what you are, then you could be gaslighted or gaslit. Right? Isn't that a gaslight? Isn't that what they mean by that? See, so my whole path has been around being called names because I was bullied for, fourth grade to sixth grade for being whatever, me. But a little gay kid, creative, different, I guess they just didn't like that. But I got called every name you can imagine. Queer and faggot were the nice versions. So I had to really look at names early in my life. I suffered over them. Being called names, being ridiculed, being labeled. One of the first memories I have of connecting homosexuality to me, as I've said, was turning on the TV, 1980 something probably, maybe 1970, actually late 70s probably. And somebody's holding a sign, God hates fags. And somehow I knew they were talking about me. And you know how that is, your system downloads that. But with me, I was an anger repressor, so that enraged me in that moment. But I didn't have my consciousness was the kind that buries anger before you know you have it. To protect you, that's how you get mom and dad's love, some of us. So by the time I saw that on TV, that would have enraged somebody who actually loves and cares about themselves. If I had been raised in a family or a world in which it was okay to be myself, I would have got pissed off. Fuck you. That would have been a natural response, but instead I just looked at it in shame. And that was in large part from, now I know, the anger repression, because I couldn't defend myself. I didn't have anger online. So when people would call me names, or aggression, when people call me names, or I saw something about myself, I just felt bad about myself. That's what anger repression does. And just, through the years, I don't want to go through all that. I don't feel any energy on it now. That's why I'm doing this, sort of a podcast. I just finished one, and I'm using the same audio equipment. But it's video. I wanted to express something about the value or the benefit of name calling or being called something, and the pain or the hurt that brings, and how valuable that is. To take us to the repression that creates the response. And if we don't go to the repression or trauma that creates our response to that name, then we're going to hold that in our bodies and suffer more and not express the anger or hurt that's already buried, for example. And then that new name that we get called just reinforces the repression that's already there. We continue suffering. When I was being bullied for being gay, I couldn't turn around and say, fuck you, motherfuckers, or anything like that. But I should have been able to do that for myself. In terms of just what would have been healthy, not necessarily at them, but be able to process that anger somehow, somewhere. I couldn't. So again, every single name, and that's why those names stuck for so many years, names that people would call me, because I couldn't defend myself, because anger repression created that inability to do anything other than suffer when someone hurt me. And I would feel hurt, because hurt wasn't, if it was repressed, it was the expression of it. But the feeling of hurt was safe enough for my experience or my system, so I would feel hurt or wounded. And that kept me safe from the buried anger, so I wouldn't express that and kill somebody, I thought, or whatever. I don't even know. Back then, I was unconscious to it. It was only later that I discovered that I had conditioning that said I was afraid to get angry because I might kill somebody. but I haven't killed anybody. And most people say that they like me more when they actually get to know me because I'm just more authentic, but that doesn't mean I'm nicer than I was. It doesn't mean I'm mean either. Labels, names. Anyway, I want to invite you into this part of the work. And I noticed that I did a podcast a while back called It's Okay to Be Misunderstood that not a lot of people saw compared to other episodes. And I want to invite you there because there's this conversation that I'm trying to start for us around some of the deep hurt that we carry around from being called names and never processing that. Like the really old, deep old stuff and how to access it. So I'm just doing this again to point to that podcast. It's okay to be misunderstood on all the platforms. But I'll talk a little bit more about it here. You know, sometimes when we're called names, the people that are calling us a name are seeing something in us. And we kind of know that. And that's part of why it hurts sometimes. Sometimes people call us names and we can't find it. Or at least it's not conscious. But our reaction, if we're conscious or we have skills, tells us so much about how and why we are responding to a particular name or label that somebody's putting on us. It takes skill to really see it, is what I've learned, to get to the root. See if I can break it down for you in words. It's best to just do the work and see. But like the example that I gave, well, I found the narcissist in me, I found everything in me, the aggression, the anger, the joy, everything that I know of, that I can see right now, that was previously buried. But on the way to that freedom, there were a few things I didn't want to own. And one, as I say in the podcast, was this narcissist thing. Because to me, anger repression, especially if you become a teacher, is a narcissistic thing. It's very covert, though. Your suffering is very covert. You hold your aggression back. You put forth something really false. And then, you have relationships and people around you who buy into that. And you want them to. You don't know you're really doing it. It's unconscious. So you kind of you get a pass, But, we're all unconscious. So what do you mean you get a pass? But some people give people a pass if they're just quiet and peaceful. That's what I'm saying, and good. And yet that too could be narcissistic. Covertly. And I took on that to keep from getting called names. I'll just tell you, I now know that whole I have to be good and all that was to keep my anger down. So I didn't want to be hurt or humiliated again, like being bullied. So I'll just be good in the world. I'll show up that way. And then, of course, that's false. So that was a setup for suffering because I'm not that. And then if somebody doesn't see me as good, for example, if somebody says narcissist, the first time that happened, later on the person said, well, you're not a narcissist, Scott. That was a shadow. And the person said, they said they had been looking up on Google. They thought that they were a narcissist and they still were convinced of it. When he admitted it to me, he said it was a shadow. But still, why did it hit me? Why did it touch something? I mean, can somebody just call you certain names and you just don't feel anything? Not because you're in repression, but because you're just so free, It's fun to test that out, actually. It's not fun, but it's freeing to test it out if you have good skill. So when that happened, even though he apologized and said it was a shadow, I was like, no. I'm not going to stay safe here because it hit a button for me. And what I found was this. I found that the narcissism of anger repression and the falseness of it, that was the narcissist thing. That's how I discovered it. But so to discover it frees you from it then, because once you own it, it's integrated as part of you. And you also see where it came from, because it comes from the trauma and repression. So that's integrated and allowed. You don't pretend anymore not to have that. So if it comes up or somebody sees something, it's not a trigger because you're like, yeah, I know. I saw, it's like, well, that's there. But you also process it to see what's driving it, right? But not to be good and to keep anger back, but to see what's true, to live authentically, to be free in suffering. There's a direct method for this that goes straight from the trigger when you get called a name, which is the trigger keeps us safe. We just don't know that until we get to repression. The trigger and the emotions that we do feel that are not repressed are all safer than, we think, it's false though, than the buried emotions. If you can understand that conceptually and then start to do the work, you'll see it experientially. You'll see that okay, let me just talk to anger repressors first, and then I'm going to talk to hurt repressors or sadness repressors second. I don't have that second repression, so I have to speak to it without going directly, because I was always afraid of anger, not hurt, really, not as much hurt or sadness. So the way I receive a trigger or experience it would be, you say or do something and I'm hurt or wounded. It's not anger. Unless you're somebody who really has hurt me a lot back then, and then eventually I might explode on you, but the explosion is because of the anger repression, the anger that I held back. Generally, it's going to be hurt back then because that was safer, and a trigger, which would be an identity like I'm unlovable or something wrong with me. And I would wallow in it, and that's what I mean. What suffering is like carrying something over in time, because we have to identify with what's false because we're holding back what's true. The anger, or, well, here the anger, right? What I didn't know is I needed to get to the mechanism that created that response, which was the anger repression, the fear of that part of me. And instead I was just, playing on the surface with these safer emotions and identity, just letting those be or processing those, which made me feel better because it doesn't touch the repression. It's a bypass. Of course you're going to feel better. And it also helps me to recognize presence, which means really also it regulates my system though. And it might help me recognize presence, but really I need to embody that anyway, or it's not really realization. So I've learned, go to the repression mechanism. It's the root of it. If you don't go to it, the trigger comes up the next time and the next time. You can end the suffering when you get to the root. So going through the years, had I known that, and this is why I'm sharing it with you, because you can pick up this work now. I didn't have it, but you do. Because the names don't hit me. Like, people can call me queer or fag. As I've said before, or maybe even earlier in this video, there have been people doing the work who have called me fag or queer, or have had homophobic slurs towards me, but nothing. What I instantly think is, oh, you're either gay or suffering if it's a guy, and usually women don't do it. So it's usually a guy who's either repressing his homosexuality or just suffering and shadowing stuff out anyway. So it's like, okay, you can suffer with that. I'm not. But it wasn't always like that until I got to the repression mechanism. There was a trigger with the narcissist thing because some of that anger repression hadn't gotten to on that. But the bullying stuff was so clear around being gay and all that, and the going through the femininity repression work. But another area is addiction. So again, when somebody says something, it can hit a button if there's already something there, but it's unconscious. And that's why being called a name, if it hits a button, is helpful. So through the years, just being called addict or thinking of myself as an addict, and then that trigger there that would keep me safe, and the shame that would come up. I didn't understand that kept me safe. So what I needed to do was I needed to look at the patterns of addiction instead of just feeling safe in the trigger of, oh, you're saying something that hurts me, right? Well, the anger repression was driving the addiction. So by just feeling ashamed about addiction and the way people look at it, I couldn't get to the root of it. So what I learned is that shame is above emotional repression in a way. Just go with me. They're just words. But in other words, see, shame is like this thing that connects to a few things in our experience. It's like I'm ashamed of expressing the emotions that I've buried. If I'm an anger repressor, I can't. If I do, I feel shame. it's attached to sexuality, body image. And so shame becomes this sort of identity that connects to all these parts of ourselves that we've buried or held back. Right? So we have to be careful when we feel shame with any label towards us. But I wanted to speak to those with addiction because I've done that work too, and it's going to help you. Is when you feel shamed in your life by people calling you names or saying something about what you're doing, the trigger keeps you safe from getting to the root of your addiction. But you can use the trigger to get to the root if you're skillful. And your system doesn't want you to get to that, to keep the addiction alive, and the trigger's there to protect you from dealing with it when other people come at you. It's a hard truth, actually, but it frees you when you're skillful. The same is true for even all labels, though. I just wanted to speak to those with addiction because there's such a stigma with that in mental health. Those labels, like mental health stuff, can really sting. Because it's also, let me go through that real quick. If somebody makes a slur about a mental state and somebody gets triggered, it doesn't feel very sensitive, of course, to say something. And I'm not encouraging that at all. I'm just saying, look at the trigger. Because if I have bipolar or something that's driven by trauma and repression, and you call me a name that makes me feel stigmatized, well, that's going to keep me safe because the safer emotions are going to come to the surface with the identity story, the deficiency. See, the identity of I'm not good enough, that protects us again from the root of that trigger, which is also the root of the mental health issue if you look at science. These triggers are keeping us safe from healing. It's like a first line of defense, feeling shamed around this. Chronic pain. I was triggered when someone said, oh, it wasn't a name, but they implied that I'm a fraud because I'm a teacher and yet I've got chronic pain. It was my own husband who said, that's emotional. So I felt the shame. That was the trigger first. Or a little bit of deficiency that protected me from the actual anger that he was referring to. He didn't know it, what it was. You see that? And if I wouldn't have processed the shame and then went to the actual repression, I wouldn't have gotten to the very root issue that he was pointing to. So the names and the things that people throw at us, they're helpful if we don't just put up our first line of defense or just process that. So don't just process triggers when people make you feel bad, because that keeps you safe from getting to the root of your suffering. That's what I'm saying. And that's true of even going back to labels that have nothing to do with mental health or addiction. Think of it this way. If I don't even want to use the example of the narcissist. Let me see another one here that somebody might. I know you guys are thinking of them right now. Like somebody's out there going, yeah, somebody called me a name the other day. It doesn't matter. So there's two ways to respond, though, in a way. You might just be numbed out and you might be checked out and disconnected and you think that you're free. You have to you have to let a name land in your body first to know. And I would suggest doing inquiry to see what the response is. Otherwise, you can stay disconnected from all this freedom that's available. So let me give an example of not even something around homosexuality. God, why am I having trouble with this? Greedy. Fuck it. I'll just pick one. Greedy. Somebody says because you change your job, you're greedy and materialistic. And then you say to yourself, no, I'm not. And there's a defense there. And you might not be, or you might be. The point is, what's going on there? There's a trigger. Because why can't you just, if you're not, why can't you just speak your truth and the emotions there that are authentic for you? Get angry, feel hurt, fear, and not hold on to any of it. But if someone says, I'll be you. If someone says to me, I'm greedy, then, well, do a boomerang first. What does it mean about me that I'm greedy? Does that mean anything else? And it might lead to some other identity, to something deeper than that. Like, I don't know, because I don't have that trigger. But you can do that. But what I would say is find out if the anger or hurt repression is under the trigger itself. You could actually process the trigger is what I'm saying. The actual greedy, I'm greedy thing. You could look for other identities under it, but that's the bypass. See? I wasn't suggesting that. I was saying that's an option. So I'm greedy as an identity comes up. Many people have no problem really questioning that to some degree because they don't want to be that. They don't want to feel that. And so questioning the trigger makes them feel better, and they don't have to get to the buried emotion if that's what's driving that trigger. See what I mean? So what might be driving it might be, how would I find that? See, it's so easy if you trust your body, and it's hard if you don't. So if I have this identity, this trigger that says I'm greedy and I'm holding on to it and defending myself or whatever, instead of just speaking my truth and moving on, you know what I mean? Because if you can speak your truth and move on, then you can go see if you're greedy or whatever. But there's something in the labels and the identities that protects us. But if you learn to go under that, and you pull up the people from your past, for example, and you use this identity or this name that somebody hurt you from the present. So let's say it's I'm greedy. And you look at your past and you just close your eyes and just trust your body. I'm not greedy. And see if there's any movement in your body. Because you already know there is. Because this hit a button. But you're just verifying that that button is hit even with the people from your past. Not just the person there. That gets you a little bit deeper in because you see this is here. It's a pattern. Must be a reason for it, right? And you feel that when you say, I'm not greedy. And your body objects like to say, yeah, you are. Okay. Here, when that contraction comes up, if you're an anger repressor, you say, I'm not angry at them. And you feel that same contraction. And you don't know why though. It might not even make sense. But it's like your body's responding to those two things in a similar way. When you say, I'm not greedy, the body goes, yeah, you are. And when you say, I'm not angry, the body says, yes, you are. And then if you say, well, I can express this anger, it's like, no. What does all that mean? We're so unconscious that many people won't hear my explanation that's about to come. But basically, we believe in these identities to keep us safe from what we've buried. We're hurt from the past, but we never processed it. So we don't know who or what we are, and we certainly haven't embodied that. So when people call us a name, especially if it gets close to something in us, it might hit a button, but we can't process it. We can't really process it on that level. That button that it hits, it comes from a much deeper place. And if you see, it actually comes from whatever you buried, even if you don't make sense of it in your mind. But once you trust your body, you start to bring that anger up when somebody calls you a name, if you're an anger repressor. Not there with them. You may, but you process it skillfully. There's a particular set of skills that you have to use because your system will fight against that completely. It'll just look like resistance. But if you pull away and you start to become skillful, you're going to start to find that not only that identity for an anger repressor, but all identities are there connected to anger repression. Why? Because it's safer to be all of those things than it is to feel and express anger in that moment of being called the name. See? Or hurt, if you're a hurt repressor. If somebody says, I'm greedy. No, I'm fucking not. Thank you. If there's nothing else to it, there's nothing else to it. Right? See if there is after that. But first go to the repression that creates the identity. You have to learn that that's what's happening first. But go there first and see if that's the reason that you did that. And see if there's anything else after that. In other words, then, because you've dealt with the reason that you're getting triggered, you can go into, is there anything else around greedy? Then you can go into that, but you've gotten to the root first to make sure you didn't bypass the root of the trigger there. Now you go over to like greedy, just as an example, and start to investigate it a little bit more just to make sure, am I missing something else? Because Scott says it's all my anger repression. Is there anything else? And then you toy around with things like, well, what would happen if, what's the thing with being greedy? Is it an image issue? People think I'm greedy. Does that bring shame? Let's go that route first. Let's see if you find that there's shame with that. There's some aspect of you that you feel shame around. What's that about? When you go back into inquiry, it's like the shame of being me. This part of me that looks greedy, I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed. But when you go deeper, you find that shame, again, connects to a few things about you. Shame to be you includes ashamed of that anger, ashamed of that sexual stuff that you repressed, ashamed of that emotion, ashamed of your body. And the shame right there might even protect you from these buried things if you're not careful. Do you see what I mean? The shame or the deficiency story that comes to the surface might still, even as you go into greedy, has to do with shame. You think, no, the shame protects you from the stuff that you buried. If you didn't bury things, you wouldn't feel shame when people say you're greedy, because you would be conscious of it all. You would see everything in your life. But there's aspects that are unconscious, and the shame protects us from them. And the aspects that are really unconscious and driving everything are the buried emotions. Let's try another example. I'm greedy. And you've already looked that it's connected to anger repression. And I'll tell you this, once you see it's connected to that, you won't be triggered by the I'm greedy thing. But if there's greed there for you to examine, you can do it. And I'll show you how you do it. It all leads back to the same place, to the anger or other repression, your primary. For example, what if being greedy is really coming from fear? Fear that you won't have enough. And so it creates this sort of like seeking for more money. Well, where does that come from? The sense of lack, the sense that something is missing. As I've been saying, something is missing in you. The buried emotions. And so as long as we have buried emotions, it feels like there's something missing. And one way that lack manifests, as in what people call greed, that's compulsive movement to get something that they feel like they're missing. Instead of just getting money to pay bills, they want more and more and more because of that lack, which is an emotional deficiency, see? But one way to bypass is to make it about greed and these other things. If we're not skillful, it all comes down to, if you'll see, we don't know who and what we are. And we can't know it just by recognizing presence, because there are buried things that are producing suffering still, responses, reactions, triggers, chronic pain, disease, until it isn't anymore. But if you can see what I've mapped out here, all roads of suffering lead back to the root, which is the repression. Here I gave the example of the anger repression, but if I would have done the same thing with hurt repressor, let me just do that real quick before I go. I have to give equal opportunity to those who have this and sadness repression, because it's not my thing. I found expression of hurt connected to being bullied and feeling anger. They were connected, but generally it's not my repression. But I've worked with enough people to know it's the same thing. So let's say somebody with hurt repression is called, it's harder to do this, I'm telling you. But any name, like you're a fraud. Somebody implicates that or something. And, well, let's say you have hurt as your primary repression, the expression of that emotion. Okay, so they call you a name. It could be any identity, but we'll say fraud. So let's say you find that and you know that that's the trigger, but what I'm saying is that's keeping you safe from the hurt repression. Because if they call you a fraud, you might get angry if you don't repress that, right? That might be a response that will protect you from the buried hurt. You might disconnect and not respond in some way or shut down, which would protect you from the buried hurt. And the trigger around being a fraud, where you just feel anger and not the buried hurt, would all be safe compared to going to the buried hurt in that moment. And so you want to go to the buried hurt for the trigger when somebody hurts you like that. But then is there something about, once you go to that, you want to process that, you can go ahead and look and see if there's some other route. So if you say, but what if I really am a fraud? Like, I know that there's anger there and I process that, but what if, how do I find out? Well, this is so obvious for me, but it's not for people until they do the work. If you pull up the people from your past again and you just reverse it and just trust the place in your body where you know you hold the repression, which is contraction, and you say with your family and loved ones up there, I'm not a fraud. And the contraction responds, I'm not a fraud. And the contraction responds as if to say, yes, you are. Well, if you just trust your body and then go over to your hurt repression and say, I'm not hurt by them, and the contraction of hurt that holds the hurt repression responds, I can show my hurt to them. And the contraction indicates a no. Well, what you learn there is that the hurt repression is driving that identity. I mean, you don't learn it from just that. When you do the work, you do. But what you learn there is that the same, if you don't think about it and trust your body, the same contraction is responding to, I'm a fraud, as I'm hurt, but I can't express it. So once you go deep into the unconscious, what you find is your system produces that identity of I'm a fraud, or the trigger around it, to protect you from the buried hurt. Right? And so the anger might come up, or some freeze state, but not the hurt. And then if you go over to investigate being a fraud, it's going to lead you back to a somatic issue, because these identities are pointing to the fact that we don't know who and what we are as long as we have repression. It takes more than presence. We have to embody that. And until we do, we're going to get triggered, and the trigger will keep us safe from the buried stuff until we learn to go to that. And if we get really busy trying to get away from that and looking to see whether I'm a fraud is connected to something else, if we're not skillful, we won't see that it's still connected to the same repression. As science says, it's emotional repression that drives a lot of suffering. Don't trust science. Don't trust me. Trust your own body. So once again, I'm just going to give you, if you want to begin the work, the free test that starts it is at the bottom of killaby.com. I'm also going to put a link to that in the description of the comments. Thank you.